Today, I'm presenting why police discretion should be limited with national use of force guidelines. Right now, officers have a lot of freedom to decide when and how to use force. This discretion is part of the job, but it can lead to inconsistencies and unfairness across states. By implementing national standards, we could create a system that protects both officers and citizens equally, regardless of where they are in the country. This isn't about restricting good policing. It's about trust, fairness, and safety for everyone that's involved. To start, let's break down what police discretion actually is. Discretion allows officers to make decisions on the spot, and it can be positive. It enables quick actions in emergencies. But without set limits, discretion can become dangerous, opening the door to personal bias. This is because human judgment can vary greatly, especially under stress or based on past experience. So, for example, one officer might interpret a suspect's movement as a threat and use force, while another might not see it that way at all. This difference is especially pronounced in cases involving racial bias, which has unfortunately led to distrust in some communities towards law enforcement. Statistics show that with fewer restrictions on police force, tend to have higher rates of deadly force incidents. This isn't just about crime rates. It's about how these varying standards affect communities. When the rules aren't consistent, citizens are left wondering if they're really safe or if their rights might be compromised based on where they live. This is a public safety and human rights concern. To show this, let's look at California and Texas. California is known for having some of the nation's strictest policies. The state's AB 392 law only permits deadly force when it's necessary to prevent serious harm or death. Officers are required to try all reasonable options first, like de-escalation or calling for backup. This approach puts an emphasis on reducing harm whenever possible and is designed to minimize fatalities. Texas, on the other hand, has much broader guidelines. Here, officers can use deadly force not only in response to an immediate threat, but also to prevent escape if they judge it to be justified. Officers have more freedom, and that can mean force is used more quickly or frequently in similar situations. Now, I'm not saying one state has better laws than the other, but this shows how big of a gap there is in what's allowed between each different state, creating confusion and frustration about when and how force might be used. So, if someone moves from California to Texas or vice versa, they're facing completely different expectations and protections. Imagine the impact this has on how people view law enforcement. When someone doesn't know if they'll be treated differently because of state laws, they lose trust. National standards would help create consistency, allowing people to trust that the same level of safety applies to them, no matter where they live. With national guidelines, every officer would follow the same core set of expectations for when to use force, rather than adapting to varied state standards. This would mean that every officer in any state is trained to approach decisions around force in the same way, improving public trust and making force incidents easier to review fairly. When national standards are in place, investigations can be more consistent and reliable. Think of it like having minimum expectation across the board. For example, a national guideline could mandate that officers attempt non-lethal options like verbal warnings whenever possible. It wouldn't take away their ability to adapt to local situations, but would set the foundation for what's considered acceptable. When everyone understands the same rules, misunderstandings and unnecessary harm are far less likely. Some argue that we can't have national standards because every state has unique needs, and I understand that point of view. But having national guidelines doesn't mean taking away all local discretion. Instead, they're about creating a baseline that's fair and ensures accountability. So officers in urban areas or rural areas might face different types of threats, but they'd all start from the same standard, which can be adapted to local training without losing that core consistency. Another counter argument says that national guidelines would interfere with an officer's ability to respond quickly in high-risk areas. But setting limits does not mean slowing down responses. It just means that responses are going to be more fair and measured. Officers would still make quick decisions when needed, but with clear and more predictable guidelines. This can prevent incidents where excessive force might have been used under vague rules. National standards aren't a new concept. For instance, we all know what Miranda rights are, and they are consistent across all states, ensuring that everyone knows their rights whenever they're arrested. This helped build a more predictable justice system, one where the public can trust they're being treated fairly. Applying a similar approach to use of force policies could increase accountability and transparency in law enforcement. If every citizen knew they'd be protected by the same rules across the country, they wouldn't have to wonder if they'd be treated differently because of state laws. National guidelines would make these rules transparent and fair, making everyone safer in the process. This approach would benefit not only just citizens, but also the officers, who would be better equipped with clear, fair guidelines they can rely on to protect themselves and others. In conclusion, while police discretion is important, it needs boundaries in order to keep everyone safe and treated fairly. National use of force guidelines would create predictable, safer standard, ensuring fairness in law enforcement across all states. Police can still use their judgment, but with clear limits that prioritize the well-being of everybody involved. This step is about respect, trust, and fairness, values that should apply equally to everyone, no matter where they are. Thank you for listening, and I hope this helped illustrate why national standards for use of force policies are needed.